Okay, good evening. It's Monday, June 30th, the last day of the first half of the year. And I do get out and about. This was Prince William Park on Friday. Just a couple pictures. I cleared some stuff off the road and so I could get through. And that's just everything is something video. And I've talked about that a little bit. There's a lot of trash around in the world. And this is really Omnia a liquid, I think, a landfill. It happens to be a gaming hotel right next to it that you can see from I-95. I didn't get that shot, but that I'll get that some other time. It's pretty silly. Um, but anyway, what I want to talk about today is let's those are my major books, three Do As Do Tell books that I've shown. And here's a map of, because I'm going to show you um, the contents of my plan, Do As Do Tell 4 book in just a minute, to show you the summary and a little bit about what I'm getting at. And I like map studies, just like Johnny Harris does, and my history teacher did. I live in Northern Virginia, and I spent a lot of my life in Arlington. And then down around here, there's Williamsburg is down here, a little bit southeast of Richmond. And then Fort Eustis, where I was in the Army. And then Columbia, South Carolina, Fort Jackson, where I had basic training. Out here in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, up near here, up near Kansas City, about 40 miles, where I went to graduate school. And Ohio, where I spent a lot of my summers around Oberlin, Kipton, and New Jersey, lived in Princeton, lived in Caldwell, lived in York for about 4 years, lived in Minneapolis more recently, and also lived down in Texas in the 80s mostly. So that just gives you, I flew around a lot, went around the country a lot, just gives you an idea how big the country is. And flying to California from Dallas, went from California from Dallas a lot of times, up into Canada, up into Calgary. One time I did a triangle fare from Alaska to Hawaii, somewhere out there. So you get, and I've been to Europe three times plus England. So you get an idea. And let's get to the book outline table of contents. And the point is each part of the book, it will be a phase of my life where there's a story, essentially a story circle. And then there's a basic change in my life. And in each part, and then each part is divided into sections depending on if I change something geographically. And then the whole idea is that at the end, I want to talk about today's problems and accelerationism, gender, that I haven't covered before, the gender ideology issue, going back to not just to Judith Butler, but to Paul Rosenfeld in the 70s. I hadn't talked about that, but we haven't talked about the world since 2014. And when I did the third do a DATT book, I didn't even mention trans in the book at all, and because it wasn't publicly an issue yet, even though it had started to be pushed a little bit. So, just to give you an idea of the structure of the book, I just think this is interesting. Um, the first chapter will just be my childhood. The second will be the details of my William and Mary expulsion in 19 over Thanksgiving 1961, and then the stay at NIH, the psychiatric treatment, if you want to call it that, and then working for NBS for a year and going to school at home. And so that leads, there's already a screenplay short I presented on this channel called An Expulsion that I'm going to try to see if I can get made. It's about 30 minutes. I've shown you that December 26th. But I also have with iUniverse, with the publisher, I have um, a I've done pitch fest with them too, one in New York and one in Los Angeles. And the pitch was to do 3 episodes based on chapters 1, 2, and 4, connecting the issue of gays in the military, which was resolved at 2011, back to problems in dormitory life where there's forced intimacy among people living together of the same sex. That was the theme. But I've expanded on the theme a lot. And so that there was actual screenplay for that. And then there is a professionally written screenplay for what would be an episode by somebody hired by Universe. So the red means that there's a screenplay. The blue means that there's a treatment that has been written. And then the second chapter would be my graduate school, and then getting drafted myself. And then the story circle there has to do with the fact that I had the power to flunk students when I was an assistant instructor and send them to the draft, some of them unfavorably, where they would get combat in Vietnam. But I got drafted eventually, but because of my education I had was kept safely stateside. And so there's a moral parable there, but that becomes a story circle. And that has 2 chapters, the grad school chapter and the chapter of actually being drafted. And then part 3 is when I became an adult and started working for my own living. And there was another big story circle. I had a couple of jobs with RCA and then came back to DC. But in 1972, I left home for good for 16 years, and I lived in New Jersey and New York for 6 years, worked for UNIVAC, then worked for NBC as my career changed, and then came out a second time as gay. And then the story circle was sort of 2 inciting incidents, one that led me to come out again, and then the start of a relationship which became complicated and led to my deciding to move to Texas, which is chapter 7. And when I was living in Texas, of course, is when the AIDS epidemic hit the gay community. And that became the surprise problem of this part of my life, the 16 years, over a very long many of years. But there basically was that structure and story and what was going on. And then a very strange job that I had at when I came back to Washington with a salary cut. I sort of reset my life, and there the treatment for episode. I've written a treatment for how you would do the writing of the books and how I was involved with the gays in the military debate. That's another possible episode and like a documentary film for a streaming channel. Then life in this very strange job I had for a consulting company, which was mixing entrepreneurialism with salary employment. Very interesting experience. Then chapter 9 of this middle page in my middle ages of my life. After coming back, the reset is coming back and working for less money and coming back to Virginia. What led me to write the book on gays in the military, and then what happened when I moved. I transferred in my job to avoid a conflict and moved to Minneapolis, and that was very interesting. I was selling my book and got involved in some things that got very interesting. And then there was another complication. By the time I was 58, there was a layoff and a lot of changes, and I wound up taking care of my mother. And I was a substitute teacher for a while, and that led to an incident that I've written a screenplay about. All these other things I've written in colors, I have existing treatments or screenplays, or the green means that the details are in a book, one of the 3 DAT books all and could be filmed. So the green, blue, and red things are things that you could make short films or shorter features of. So there's about 10 ideas for movies embedded in this to make films of. But the most important one right now is the William and Mary expulsion. And then at the end, I will chronologically show how I look at today's problems, how I look at individual responsibility. Freedom as being a matter of individual responsibility, not simply a matter of whether you're belong to an oppressed or an oppressor group, but you have to go all the way. And I'm considering the religious idea of reincarnation, and you don't get to choose what you're born into generally, but maybe sometimes you do. And there's more and more evidence that there's something to the fact that in other dimensions, some of us do have an afterlife and other dimensions. That it's getting more likely that we're going to discover the science of that someday. And so some of this other topics, the gender ideology, immigration, and this accelerationism, whether or not the rich people are arranging the policies to make it look like they're supporting personal freedom for people who are fit enough, but going to throw everybody else under the bus in other parts of the world. That ties into the immigration issue with Trump, of course, and ICE and all of that. And then I have some completed feature scripts already. One of them is registered with. Actually, two of them are registered with Writers Guild. Second Epiphany takes place on a spaceship and on an O'Neill cylinder, but it embeds the stories of some of these stories when I'm living on the spaceship. Williamsburg and Charlotte is sort of one continuous screenplay going from William and Mary all the way to the writing of the book and the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I've written one screenplay myself from the point of view of my parents for the most part. And then I wrote a couple of other screenplays when living in Minneapolis. One called Make the A-List, which is where you presume you make a movie or about my expulsion, and then you tell the story of the actor who plays me. That's the idea of that idea. And that's what could be a series. The problem with it is that the political circumstances have changed. It isn't 2001 anymore. This was written after 9/11, and the 9/11 world is what it's based on. And I also have a more distantly related screenplay, this sort of science fiction called 69 Minutes to Titan, which gets involved with, starts out with my situation, winds up with some alien abductions. And then Project Greenlight had a couple of screenwriting contests, and in 2004, I entered one of them with this sci-fi story of Baltimore is Missing, where you get on and there's something happening to Earth with an object approaching Earth, and you get on a train to Baltimore. You go in the tunnel, and when you come out of the tunnel, you've changed universes or something. You're no longer in the same world, and you find out you're living in somebody else's model railroad. It's a horror film, of course, and you're going to have a very simplified life in somebody else's zoo, essentially. But I entered that in a contest in 2004. So that's some of the stuff I've done. I just wanted to mention, from the practical screenwriting group, one of the other people came up with these steps of a character arc, and this is more or less what happens in each part of this book. There's something unsettling and something I want to change, and I change it, and then there's an initial problem with the change. It's sort of like an inciting incident, but not exactly. And I make an initial choice, and I achieve something. But when I try to achieve more, I get a pivotal problem, and there can be several pivotal problems and several pivotal choices. But one of the most important was that I left New York City after a relationship stumbled for complicated reasons, and that probably prevented me from ever getting HIV myself and saved my life. I moved to Texas because took longer for for aides to get to Dallas, and by then we knew we had to be careful. But we had a horrible time in Texas with it anyway in the mid '80s, so that's a very big story circle there. But my expulsion in 1961, that's a story circle we made. And in my military service along with graduate school, that makes another story circle. And then just the whole writing of the books and some of the issues of free speech and freedom of reach um, would is what you would get. Now, I also let me go back to it didn't stay in Drive. I've got another. I've got a book outline that shows for in each part, it shows, and I'm not going to go over this in detail, but it shows the stages, the 1 through 8 of the story circle, and they start over with each part. And then sort of there's 9/11 as one of the big pivotal problems. And at the end, I'm going to talk about some of the concepts about bringing these issues up to date, particularly accelerationism and gender theory and immigration, of course, fitting into that, and the workplace, and identity versus individualism and spirituality, and religion and so forth comes up, and that would be the end. Also, just to show you, just very briefly, what chapter 6, just look at chapter 6. You see what the new book text looks like. And if I can get down to, this is 1972 to 1978. And trying to get to something here. Yeah, there's something where I try to explain where I had this. Yeah, here it is. One of the biggest issues personally is if I don't fit in to forming a family myself and take responsibility for others and have skin in the game, do I have a right to be heard? Or should I have to take care of someone else? That's one of the issues. And another issue is that if in my personal taste, I want to identify with the partner that I choose because I think the partner is superior and is a gay man. And if everybody does that, is that something that leads to so much meritocracy that a lot of people are left out? And that's what contributes to the idea that led to transgenderism, for example, becoming popular. Does that tend to metastasize into political fascism? Because quite frankly, a lot of the things that Trump is doing actually do comport with the things I believe, even though he's threatened the Constitution, which I don't think is okay. But a lot of his individual policies really do pin things back down to people owning their own problems and not just claiming that their problems are because they belong to the wrong group, but people owning their own developmental problems essentially as individuals. He kind of expects people to own their own difficulties. And so the various paragraphs some of them are about the workplace, some of them are about trips I took, when I really traveled a lot before 9/11 when it was a lot easier. When I was working, I really traveled all the time to certain places I showed you on that map. And here, and Some of them are about how technology changes, or about how some issues change, personal conduct issues, and how workplace technology changed and workplace style changed. And all this fits into the ideas I'm going to write at the end about my conclusions about these issues today, particularly the gender stuff and particularly the accelerationism, the fact that we may be, we don't, our future on this planet is compromised. And what we may be doing is the Trump, Elon and Trump and the Republicans are doing is saving enough for the people that take keep for themselves and getting rid of everybody else because there's not enough to go around. That may be what Putin is doing, what nationalism is all about too. Um, what tribalism is all about is not everybody's going to survive. Not every country is going to survive. So you've got to fight for your own tribe. That means you got to have babies and reproduce, which is why some of these societies are, want to eliminate even all discussion of homosexuality, not just what you call pornography. Remember that the Project 2025 handbook on page 5 talked about pornography, but said discussing transgenderism was itself pornography, that some kinds of discussions were pornography, because they think it discourages other people from wanting to have children and marry, I was never exposed to pornography as a child, and I simply it's more that men that don't have enough drive to reproduce with women generally all the time get pickier about what they're attracted to. Being attracted to something really means a lot more, and then that kind of encourages and goes along with the psychology of gay men, I think. Nobody talks about it that way, and it is controversial. You know, also, I don't know if I mentioned yesterday when talking about books, children, the Supreme Court and children's books and parents and so forth, Montgomery County. Yeah, I mean, people would say I should write for things that are popular that people want, and that people want children's books and they want to support left wing stuff. They want stuff that can be in schools. They want to actually sell to children so they can make money. And I did not do that. But of course, I'm not very commercial and not being depending on my, and the fact accumulated wealth from the past and my parents, my mother's inheritance. Morally, it doesn't really put me in a good position. So that's something I'll talk about in the book, because that feeds into the issues I'm going to talk about for. So that's what I have today, and I do thank you for listening to this. And you'll be hearing more about the book. I talked about it on May 27th before, if you look, but you'll be hearing more about it again soon. And thank you very much for listening.